Lady. Mr. Forbes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Dempsey, the country owes you a great deal of gratitude. We thank you for your service, all you've done for this committee and for the country. Mr. Secretary, we thank you for being here today, and it was my full intention to come in here and applaud you and talk about how talented you were, which I believe that to be the case, and realize what a difficult job you have until I heard your opening remarks. And let me just ask this question, because you heard Chairman Thornberry mention the phrase that if we get anything below the President's budget, that we would go below the lower ragged edge of what we need for national defense. Do you agree with that?
I do.
And would you therefore say if we're going below a lower ragged edge that it would be a crisis for national defense if we went to sequestration as opposed to the budget that the President proposed? Yes. So that would be yes.
Yeah.
Would you also say that that would be devastating to defense if we went there?
Devastating.
Then help me with this, because what really took me back is when you said that you supported the President's position to veto any bill that didn't do away with sequestration, because you do understand that the President's position is that he would veto any bill that doesn't do away with sequestration, not just for national defense, but also for everything else. Do you understand that's the President's position?
I do.
So then what you're telling me is the Secretary of Defense, you would be prepared to support a veto that would end up with a crisis for national defense and be devastating to national defense unless the President can also get all the funding he needs for EPA, IRS, and all the other non-defense items that he's proposed in the budget. Is that your position?
What we need for defense, Congressman Ford, is two things. We need stability.
No, that's not my question, and I don't mean to cut you off, but as the Chairman said, I only have 5 minutes. I just need to have you tell this committee that as the Secretary of Defense, you are coming here today and saying that unless the President gets a full sequestration, taking off the limits of spending that he has on EPA, IRS, and other non-defense matters, you would rather have a crisis when it comes to national defense funding.
No, that's not.
Then would you support a bill that this committee would pass that would do away with sequestration for national defense only?
No, the President, no, I would not.
So then you would support.
I'll tell you why. We need relief from sequestration across the board. Every other manager of an agency in the government.
Mr. Secretary, you're not managing all these other agencies. You're coming in here today telling us that you prepared to accept a crisis for national defense unless the President gets the funding he needs for EPA or the Internal Revenue Service or all these other programs he has across the country?
No, Congressman, I take a view of national defense and national security that takes into account the fact that to protect ourselves and as part of security, we need the Department of Homeland Security.
I'm not saying that, but I'm saying you don't necessarily need the Internal Revenue Service.
We need our law enforcement agencies. Well, I think each of those budgets can be looked at in their own terms.
Mr. Secretary, you are the expert on defense, and what we need is that testimony today. And what bothers me is when you'll come in here and say that you'd rather have a crisis in national defense, which is what the President's saying, by the way, than to cut or have a cap on any non-defense spending that could be in anywhere else in the government. And I just find that a travesty. And let me just say this.
No, I think what the President's saying, Congressman, and which I agree with, is that we need relief from sequester across the board. It's no way to run the government.
But you're the expert on defense. And we may argue on IRS or EPA, but what we need is when you come in here as Secretary of Defense to tell us that you're not willing to accept a crisis in national defense if you can't get everything you want with the IRS or EPA, some of these other funding programs. And just to put it on the line, when you talk about the flexibility that you need in the Department of Defense, let's just recognize also that sometimes Congress has to hold that flexibility. If we'd have given it to the Pentagon in the 80s, we wouldn't have stealth platforms, we wouldn't have precision munitions, we probably wouldn't have jointness. And also sometimes when you talk about these outside cuts to facilities, remember what we did to the Joint Forces Command. Oh, we cut that down and said we're going to save all the money. All we did is take all those jobs and centralize them in the Pentagon and in the Joint Staff. So we need to make sure, Mr. Secretary, and I say this with all due respect, that we're dealing with the crisis we have in national defense. That's what this committee should be about. That's what the Pentagon should be about. And we shouldn't have to hinge all of that on what happens to the Internal Revenue Service or the EPA. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.